Every day, we hear the same headlines: missile strikes, rising tensions. Warnings of a wider war in the Middle East. News reports describe Iran and Israel as lifelong enemies, nations locked in an unavoidable conflict. And almost every discussion eventually leads to one familiar question: will the United States be pulled deeper into another war? But what if the story we hear every day is missing its most important chapter? Because long before threats, sanctions, and shadow wars, Iran, Israel, and America were not standing on opposite sides of history. They were connected, not just diplomatically, but historically, strategically, and even ideologically. In fact, the alliance between these nations began thousands of years before modern borders existed, when an ancient Persian king made a decision that changed the fate of the Jewish people forever. Centuries later, another rising power would unknowingly repeat that role, reshaping the Middle East once again. And that power was the United States. This is not simply a story about conflict. It is a story about protection, survival, and unintended consequences. Because to understand why these nations clash today, we must first uncover how they became allies in the first place. And the story begins not with modern war, but with an empire that chose mercy over conquest. But to understand why America became central to this story, we must go back thousands of years to an alliance almost erased from memory. More than 2,500 years ago, the world was ruled by empires built on conquest. Cities fell, populations were enslaved, and defeated nations rarely regained their freedom. Among those conquered people were the Jews. Exiled from Jerusalem after the Babylonian Empire destroyed their homeland in the 6th century BC, for decades, they lived far from the land that defined their identity, uncertain whether their civilization would survive. Then history took an unexpected turn. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great, ruler of the Persian Empire, conquered Babylon. But unlike kings before him, Cyrus did something almost unheard of in the ancient world. Instead of forcing assimilation or punishment, he allowed displaced peoples to return home, including the Jewish population. Historical records and biblical accounts describe how Cyrus authorized the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the restoration of the Jewish temple. To many Jewish communities, he was not remembered as a conqueror, but as a liberator. This moment created one of history's earliest recorded alliances between Persia and the Jewish people, an interaction rooted not in war, but cooperation. For centuries afterward, Persian rule became associated with tolerance and stability across diverse cultures and religions. It was an early example of power used to preserve identity rather than erase it, but history rarely moves in straight lines. Empires rise, alliances fade, and new powers inherit old responsibilities. Nearly two millennia later, another global power would face a similar moral crossroads during one of humanity's darkest chapters. A war unlike anything the world had ever seen was about to begin. And once again, the survival of the Jewish people would depend on the actions of a rising superpower. This time, the stage was no longer ancient Persia. It was the modern world, and the nation stepping into history was America. That ancient protection would echo through history, because centuries later, another global crisis would force America to step into the fate of the Jewish people once again. By the early 20th century, the world had changed beyond recognition. Empires had fallen. New nations emerged from the ruins of old kingdoms, and technological progress made warfare more destructive than ever before. Then came World War II. Across Europe, Nazi Germany launched a campaign not only of conquest, but extermination. Millions of Jews were systematically persecuted, displaced, and murdered in what would become known as the Holocaust. For the Jewish people, history seemed to repeat itself once again: exile, survival, and uncertainty about the future. First, the United States remained distant from the conflict. Many Americans believed the war belonged to Europe. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, America entered the war fully, transforming from an observer into the decisive force. American industry powered the Allied war effort. American soldiers crossed oceans to fight in unfamiliar lands. And as Allied forces advanced into Europe, they began discovering the unimaginable reality of concentration camps. The liberation of these camps changed global consciousness forever. Images of survivors revealed a truth the world could no longer ignore. After the war ended, a question emerged that would redefine geopolitics. Where could the Jewish people live safely again? For many leaders, the answer pointed toward the historic land of Israel. In 1948, when the State of Israel declared independence, the United States became one of the first nations to recognize it. This decision marked the beginning of a powerful political and strategic relationship, one that would shape Middle Eastern history for decades. But while America supported the birth of Israel, another relationship was quietly forming at the same time. Because Iran, then ruled by a pro-Western monarchy, was not Israel's enemy. In fact, the two nations were becoming partners. The Middle East was entering a new era, one defined not by ancient empires, but by oil, security, and Cold War strategy. And for a brief moment in history, America, Israel, and Iran stood on the same side. But what happened next is rarely discussed, because at the very moment Israel was born, an unlikely friendship was forming in secret. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Middle East became one of the most important arenas of the Cold War. The United States sought allies who could prevent Soviet influence from spreading across the region. Iran, under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, emerged as one of Washington's closest partners. Modernization programs transformed Iran's economy. American advisors helped develop infrastructure, military capability, and energy industries. At the same time, Israel, surrounded by hostile neighbors, searched for regional partners willing to cooperate quietly. Iran became one of them. Despite religious and cultural differences, the two countries shared strategic interests. Iran supplied oil to Israel. Israeli engineers and intelligence experts cooperated with Iranian institutions. Trade expanded behind diplomatic silence. This cooperation became known as the Periphery Alliance, a network of non-Arab states aligned indirectly with Western interests. To outsiders, the partnership remained almost invisible. But beneath the surface, intelligence sharing strengthened ties. For policymakers in Washington, this triangular relationship created stability. It appeared that the Middle East had found a balance. Yet stability built on political systems rather than public support can be fragile. Inside Iran, dissatisfaction was growing. Economic inequality widened. Western influence triggered cultural resistance, and opposition movements slowly gained strength. The alliance that seemed permanent was already beginning to crack, because in 1979, a revolution would transform allies into adversaries almost overnight. The alliance looked stable, even permanent, until one year changed everything and turned partners into enemies overnight. In 1979, Iran experienced one of the most dramatic political transformations of the modern era. Mass protests swept across the country. Millions demanded the end of monarchical rule. The Shah, America's strongest regional ally, fled Iran. In his place rose Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who established the Islamic Republic. The revolution was not only political, it was ideological. The new leadership rejected Western influence and condemned both American foreign policy and Israeli statehood. Almost instantly, decades of cooperation collapsed. Diplomatic ties with Israel were severed. American influence vanished. Former allies became symbols of opposition. The U.S. Embassy hostage crisis deepened mistrust between Washington and Tehran, turning tensions into a lasting geopolitical rivalry. For Israel, the shift was equally dramatic. A country that once received oil and quiet cooperation from Iran now faced hostility. The regional balance that America helped build during the Cold War suddenly disappeared. But the irony was profound. The foundations connecting these nations, trade routes, energy systems, and strategic geography did not vanish. Even as political hostility grew, global systems continued linking their interests indirectly. The alliance had ended politically, but history had already tied their futures together. And nowhere would that hidden connection become clearer than in the world's energy networks. Yet revolutions can change governments, but they cannot erase geography, resources, or dependence. Energy reshaped global power in the late 20th century. Oil and natural gas determined economic survival, military capability, and international alliances. Iran possessed some of the world's largest energy reserves. America depended on stable global energy markets. Israel relied on secure trade routes and regional balance. Even without direct cooperation, their decisions influenced one another. Sanctions placed on Iran affected global oil prices. Regional tensions influenced shipping routes like the Strait of Hormuz. Energy markets connected rivals through economic consequences. This created a paradox of modern geopolitics. Nations could oppose each other politically while remaining economically interconnected. Conflict no longer existed in isolation. Every escalation echoed across markets, alliances, and global supply chains. The Middle East was no longer just a battlefield, it was the engine room of the global economy. And the deeper the world depended on energy, the more dangerous instability became. And as energy tied rivals together invisibly, conflict evolved into something far more dangerous than traditional war. By the early 21st century, confrontation between Iran and Israel entered a new phase. Wars were no longer declared formally. Instead, conflict moved into shadows. Cyber attacks targeted infrastructure. Covert operations disrupted nuclear programs. Regional proxy groups turned neighboring countries into indirect battlegrounds. The United States found itself navigating a complex position, supporting Israel while attempting to prevent full-scale regional war. Diplomacy alternated with pressure. Negotiations mixed with sanctions. Each side avoided direct confrontation, yet tensions never truly disappeared. This became the defining feature of modern conflict: continuous competition without open war. Ironically, the same nations, once linked by cooperation, were now locked in strategic containment. But beneath the hostility remained an uncomfortable truth. Their histories were intertwined, and the past continued shaping every modern decision. After decades of tension, one question remains: were these nations ever truly enemies, or simply actors in a longer historical cycle? Modern audiences often see international conflicts as permanent rivalries, yet history reveals something different. Relationships between nations evolve. Allies become competitors, enemies become partners, and political identities shift across generations. The story of Iran, Israel, and America demonstrates how quickly geopolitical narratives can transform. Ancient cooperation led to modern alliances. Modern alliances transformed into rivalry. Understanding this history changes how we interpret today's headlines. Because current conflicts are not isolated events, they are chapters in a much longer story. And recognizing that continuity may be the key to understanding what happens next. To answer that, we must step back from politics and look at the deeper pattern history keeps repeating. Today, headlines focus on division, missiles, sanctions, rising fears of war. But history tells a more complicated story. Iran once protected the Jewish people. America once helped secure their future. Israel once cooperated with Iran in shaping regional stability. These realities challenge the idea that conflict is inevitable. They remind us that geopolitics is not driven only by ideology, but by circumstance, leadership, and historical moments. The alliances of the past reveal possibilities the present often forgets. And perhaps the greatest irony is this: the nations now defined as adversaries were once connected by shared goals of survival and security. So the question is no longer simply who stands against whom. The real question is whether history moves in cycles, and whether today's enemies could someday become partners again. Because before every war, there was always a different story. And sometimes, understanding that forgotten story is the first step toward understanding the future. History rarely begins with enemies. More often, it begins with alliances we forget to remember. If this story changed how you see today's conflicts, you're already seeing history differently than most people. Because this is only one chapter of a much larger story. A world where former allies become rivals, and rivals sometimes become allies again. Subscribe to ThinkSmart Media and explore the hidden connections behind the headlines, the stories before the war ever begins. And now, the next question is even more unsettling. What happens when global power shifts away from nations and into energy itself?